All right, ready to get philosophical. Today we're taking a deep dive into coherentism. And, not just a quick overview. We're going deep, really exploring it from a philosopher's perspective like you requested. Yeah, we're going way beyond Coherentism 101. Exactly. And to guide our deep dive, we've got the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on coherentist theories of epistemic justification. So to kick things off, remind me, what's the central issue that coherentism is trying to tackle?
It all comes back to that age-old question, right? How do we justify what we know? The traditional answer, think Plato, Descartes, is foundationalism.
Right, foundationalism. It argues that knowledge needs this solid foundation of absolutely certain beliefs.
Exactly. Like a skyscraper needs a super strong foundation to hold up the entire structure. For foundationalists, those foundational beliefs, they're like self-evident truths. You can't doubt them.
So like, I exist, or basic math axioms, but even those have been challenged, haven't they?
You got it. And that's a big criticism of foundationalism. Finding truly indubitable beliefs, it's way harder than it seems. Rationalists, who focus on reason, they struggle to find a starting point that's completely immune to skeptical arguments. And then empiricists, they emphasize sense experience, but then you run into issues like illusions or hallucinations, or just the fact that our senses can be unreliable.
And it sounds like that foundation starts crumbling pretty quickly when you look closely. So where does coherentism come in?
Coherentism, it kind of offers this whole new way of looking at things. It says instead of searching for this perfect, unshakable foundation, why don't we focus on how beliefs connect to each other? Knowledge, for coherentists, is about the coherence of our entire belief system, how well the pieces fit together.
So it's less like building a skyscraper on solid ground and more like, I don't know, weaving a web. Where the strength comes from, how interconnected the threads are.
Perfect analogy. Coherentists say a belief is justified not because it's based on some special foundational belief, but because it supports and is supported by other beliefs within a coherent system.
I can see why that's appealing. It seems more in line with how we actually think, right? We don't constantly trace our beliefs back to some ultimate foundation. We evaluate them based on how well they fit with everything else we think we know about the world.
Exactly. And a great example of this is Laurence Bonjour, a prominent coherentist. He emphasizes that it's the system of beliefs that's justified, first and foremost, not the individual beliefs on their own.
That makes sense, but it also raises some questions for me, like, couldn't I have a perfectly coherent system of beliefs about, say, the Earth being flat? As long as those beliefs all fit together, how does coherentism address the possibility of having a coherent system that's totally false?
Ah, you've hit on one of the classic challenges to coherentism. It's called the isolation objection. How can we be sure that a coherent system actually reflects reality if coherence is just this internal, systemic property?
Right. A beautiful, intricate web of beliefs isn't much good if it's all spun out of falsehoods to begin with.
You got it. And then it gets even trickier with the alternative systems problem. Like, what if there are many different coherent belief systems, each one internally consistent, but they contradict each other? If coherence is all you need for justification, wouldn't that mean contradictory beliefs could all be equally justified?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So do coherentists just give up on the idea of truth?
Not at all. Most of them, especially contemporary coherentists, they're not ready to embrace relativism. A lot of them try to bridge that gap between coherence and truth by saying that certain types of beliefs have a special status, the ones that are closely tied to our sensory experiences.
So not a rock-solid foundation in the foundationalist sense, but maybe a few anchor points that are more likely to reflect reality than, say, my belief that the Earth is flat.
Right on. Those anchor points, they give you a place to start building a coherent system. And that makes it more likely that the whole system lines up with the real world.
Okay, starting to see how coherentism avoids the problems of foundationalism while still grounding our beliefs in something more than just internal consistency. But this whole idea of coherence itself still feels a bit fuzzy, How do we define what makes a belief system coherent in the first place?
That's where things get really interesting and where we start to see different versions of coherentism emerge. Philosophers have tried to pin down coherence more precisely, and each attempt has its pros and cons.
I'm curious about those attempts. Let's unpack them, see how philosophers have tried to grasp this slippery concept.
One of the earliest and most rigorous definitions comes from A.C. Ewing. He took a very strict, logic-based approach.
So for Ewing, a coherent belief system, it's essentially like a well-structured logical argument.
Exactly. He argued that for a system to be truly coherent, it has to meet two main criteria. consistency and entailment. Consistency means there are no contradictions within the system, and entailment means that each belief logically follows from all the other beliefs taken together.
So, a super tight, logically airtight system. It's ambitious. But is that realistic? I mean, do our everyday belief systems actually work like that?
That's the question, isn't it? And it highlights one of the problems with Ewing's definition. It sets a very high bar for coherence, a bar that most of our actual belief systems probably couldn't reach. Take a classic example, John and the crime scene. Let's say you have three beliefs. John was at the crime scene, John owns a gun like the one used in the robbery, and John deposited a suspicious amount of money the next day.
Okay, those beliefs seem connected. They paint a pretty incriminating picture of John. But do they fit Ewing's strict definition of coherence?
Not quite. While those beliefs are suggestive, none of them logically entails the others. Just because John owns a similar gun and deposited money, that doesn't prove he was at the crime scene. There could be other explanations.
You're right. So Ewing's definition, while logically elegant, might be too narrow. It doesn't really capture how messy and complex real-world belief formation is.
Exactly. And that's where C.I. Lewis comes in with a more flexible approach. His idea is rooted in probability.
Probability. So we're moving away from logical certainty to degrees of belief. Tell me about Lewis's view.
Yeah, Lewis is all about degrees of belief. He said a set of beliefs is coherent if the probability of each belief goes up when you assume the other beliefs are true. So it's this idea of mutual support, even if it's not strict logical entailment.
So in that John example, believing he was at the crime scene isn't a logical certainty based on the other beliefs, but it becomes more probable given those other beliefs. And same goes for believing he owns the gun or made that deposit. Each belief kind of props up the others, boosting their overall probability.
Exactly. The system hangs together in terms of probability, even if it doesn't meet the strict rules of logic. This approach lets us create models of belief systems that are more nuanced, more realistic, capturing how we weigh evidence and make judgments when things aren't certain.
I like the flexibility of Lewis's view, but it also feels like it adds a whole new layer of complication. How do you even measure this probabilistic support? How much does the probability need to increase for us to say a belief is supported by the others?
That is a key question, and it's something coherentists are still working on. There's a whole area of research focused on developing precise mathematical measures of coherence. And unsurprisingly, there's no one formula that everyone agrees on.
I can imagine it gets pretty tricky trying to quantify something as slippery as coherence, but I'm curious to hear about these attempts at measurement. What are some of the main approaches?
Well, one big idea is the content determination thesis. It says that the coherence of a belief system depends on the probabilities of the propositions themselves, not on any subjective factors. And this thesis leads to all sorts of different measures, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
So we're talking about objective measures. They try to capture coherence based purely on what the beliefs are and their probabilistic relationships. What are some examples of these measures?
One that gets talked about a lot is called C sub 1 sub, and it focuses on the amount of overlap or agreement between beliefs. Think of it like this. If two beliefs overlap a lot in terms of what they're saying, then they contribute a lot to the overall coherence of the system.
So more agreement equals higher coherence score, according to C sub 1 sub.
Yeah.
Seems pretty straightforward, but are there any drawbacks to this measure?
Well, one issue is that C sub 1 sub doesn't really consider the number of propositions in the system. Two beliefs that overlap a lot could score just as high as 100 beliefs with the same degree of overlap. And that seems to miss something important about the richness and interconnectedness of larger belief systems.
Right, the size and complexity of the web should matter, not just how tight a few individual threads
We
are.
got it. Another measure, this one was developed by Shogenji, tries to fix that. It looks at how surprising the agreement between beliefs is given their individual probabilities. The idea is a system where lots of unlikely beliefs agree with each other is more coherent than a system where only a few very probable beliefs agree.
I see. It's not just about how much agreement there is, but how unexpected or striking that agreement is. Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say we've got a bunch of witnesses describing a crime. If they all agree on a very basic description, like John, Paul, or Mary did it, that's not as surprising or coherence boosting as if they all independently point to John as the culprit, especially if John wasn't a likely suspect to begin with. The specificity and the unexpectedness of that agreement make the coherence score higher in Shogenji's measure.
That's a good example. This measure seems to capture something important about how coherence can come from multiple sources of information that all converge. But are there any potential issues with Shogenji's approach?
Oh, definitely. One concern is that it might overemphasize specificity. Sometimes agreeing on a broad claim can be just as meaningful as agreeing on a really narrow one, especially if that broad claim goes against what people commonly believe or what we expected.
This is getting pretty deep into the weeds here. So many different ways to look at this concept of coherence. Is there any agreement at all on which measure is the best or most accurate?
Nope, not really. The debate about how to best measure coherence is still going strong. But all these attempts at quantifying it have been really valuable. They help us understand better what coherence could mean, how it might work in different situations, and what its limitations might be.
So even without one perfect measure, these explorations give us a more precise grasp of this slippery concept. It's like mapping out a huge, intricate landscape. But let's zoom back out for a minute. We've talked a lot about how different philosophers have tried to define and measure coherence. But we started this whole discussion by saying coherentism is an alternative to foundationalism, a different way of thinking about knowledge and justification. How well does coherentism actually hold up against its rival? Are there any fatal flaws or knockout arguments that settle the debate once and for all?
Now, that's a question that has fueled countless philosophical debates. There are strong arguments to be made on both sides. One of the most persistent challenges to coherentism, and we touched on this earlier, is the isolation objection, that worry that a belief system could be totally coherent, but still completely detached from reality. Like, even if all my beliefs fit together perfectly, how can I be sure they're not just some elaborate fantasy?
It's that classic brain in a vat scenario, right? I could have this super coherent belief system about being a world-famous chef,
Yes.
even if I'm actually just a brain floating in a tank somewhere.
Exactly. And this challenge gets even sharper when you consider those alternative coherent systems. What if you have multiple systems, equally coherent, but they contradict each other? If coherence on its own is enough for justification, doesn't that lead to this kind of epistemic relativism, where any coherent story is as good as any other?
That would be pretty unsettling. It would undermine our whole confidence in being able to tell truth from falsehood, actual knowledge from just delusion.
So how do coherentists answer these challenges? Do they have any convincing ways to ground coherence in something more than just internal consistency?
They do, and their responses often involve the role of experience in shaping and limiting our beliefs. Even the most hardcore coherentists know that our beliefs don't just pop up out of nowhere. They're constantly being influenced and tested by our interactions with the world.
So it's not just about beliefs fitting neatly in our heads, it's also about how those beliefs interact with and are shaped by our actual experiences.
Exactly. A lot of coherentists argue that certain types of beliefs, the ones that are closely linked to our sensory perceptions, have this kind of default credibility.
Huh.
Now, they're not infallible, of course, but they serve as good starting points for building a coherent system. They're that crucial link between our inner world of beliefs and the outside world of experience. So it's like those sensory beliefs act as anchors. They tie our web of beliefs to something more solid than just internal consistency. But how do these anchors actually work? Are they like a weak foundation, as some people have suggested?
That's a common way to think about it. Coherentism, in this view, isn't about rejecting foundationalism altogether. It's more like a refined, more subtle version of it. Instead of looking for this small set of totally certain foundational beliefs, it acknowledges that many of our beliefs have some degree of initial plausibility based on our experiences.
So it's not about finding a perfect, unmovable base. It's more about recognizing that some beliefs are more likely to be true than others, and that's based on how we interact with the world.
Right. And we build our coherent systems from these starting points, these experience-grounded beliefs. Coherence then becomes this powerful tool for expanding and refining our understanding, for connecting the dots and building a rich tapestry of knowledge.
I'm following you. Coherence plays this crucial role in shaping and justifying our beliefs, but it's not working in isolation. It's working together with experience, constantly getting input from and being tested against the world around us. But there's something I'm still a bit puzzled by. If coherence is mostly about internal consistency, how do we explain the fact that we often use coherence to evaluate competing claims about the outside world? Like, we rely on coherence when we're trying to figure out which scientific theory is more accurate or which historical account is more believable.
That's a great point, and it leads us to one of the most fascinating and debated aspects of coherentism, the question of whether coherence can actually track truth. Can a completely coherent belief system, even one grounded in experience, really lead us to true beliefs about the world?
That's the big question, isn't it? Can we trust coherence to guide us to truth, or is it just a way of making a nice, neat story in our heads, whether or not that story matches reality?
There are strong opinions on both sides, and a lot of the discussion focuses on the role of probability in how coherence relates to truth. Some philosophers, like C.I. Lewis, they say coherence can increase the probability of a belief being true, but it can't do it from scratch. There has to be some initial degree of warrant or plausibility for a belief to be eligible for coherence-based justification.
So Lewis thought coherence was more like a signal booster than a signal generator. It can make an existing signal stronger, but it can't create a signal out of thin air.
That's it, exactly. But other philosophers, like Lawrence Bonjour, they've argued that sometimes coherence itself can be enough for justification. Even if the individual beliefs have no initial credibility, this view is often called pure or radical coherentism.
That's a much bolder claim.
Yeah.
It suggests that coherence, in the right conditions, can be a source of justification, not just something that boosts already existing justification. I want to hear more about this debate, especially how it works when you bring in all the heavy stuff from probability theory.
And that's where things get really interesting, where some of the biggest advancements in coherentism have happened. Using probability theory has allowed philosophers to analyze the relationship between coherence and truth in a more precise way and to explore what coherence can and can't do.
Let's dive into that probabilistic deep end. I'm ready to get my mind blown a little.
One really important figure in this area is Erik Olson. He used probability theory to analyze the conditions under which coherence can actually lead to justification. His work, which builds on some earlier arguments by Michael Huemer, has some pretty surprising and thought-provoking conclusions.
Okay, lay it on me. What kind of probabilistic framework did he use to analyze coherence?
He looked at a situation with independent testimonies, a classic problem in epistemology. So imagine you have two witnesses, both reporting on the same event, but their testimonies are conditionally independent.
Hang on, let's back up a second. What does conditionally independent even mean in this context?
It means that one witness's report doesn't directly influence the other's report. They're both responding to the same event, but not to each other. Think of it like two people flipping coins. The result of one coin flip doesn't change the outcome of the other. They're independent events.
Got it. So with the witnesses, it's like they're each giving their account based on what they saw, not on what the other witness said.
Exactly. Now let's add another layer. What if these witnesses are individually unreliable? Their track record isn't great. They've been known to get things wrong before.
Like those witnesses you see on those late-night shows, the ones claiming they saw Bigfoot riding a unicorn. You can't just take their word for it on their own.
Yeah, perfect example. Now, the question is, what happens when these independent but unreliable witnesses agree? Does their agreement, their coherence, somehow make their combined testimony more believable?
That's that whole strength in numbers idea, right? Even if each witness is kind of shaky on their own, if they all tell the same story, maybe there's something to it.
That's the idea. And it's the kind of scenario that coherentists use to show that coherence itself can justify a belief. But Olson took that intuition and made it formal using probability theory. He wanted to see if it holds up under close examination.
So he put this strength in numbers idea through a mathematical test. What did he find?
Well, his findings were pretty surprising. He proved that if you've got conditional independence, meaning the testimonies are truly independent, and non-foundationalism, meaning the individual testimonies aren't initially credible, then coherence just can't create justification out of thin air.
Wait, so you're saying that even if you have like 100 unreliable witnesses all agreeing on the same story, their combined testimony is no more likely to be true than if we just heard it from one of them? That doesn't seem right.
It does seem counterintuitive, but that's what the math shows. Olson's proof, which is actually quite elegant, demonstrates that in these conditions, coherence can only boost existing credibility. It can't make something credible out of nothing.
Okay, my brain is starting to hurt, but in a good way. This is making me rethink how we justify beliefs. So if Olson's proof is right, what does this mean for coherentism? Is it a dead end?
No, not at all. It just means we need to be a bit more careful about how we understand coherence and what its limits are. Some philosophers have questioned the assumptions behind Olson's proof, specifically that strict definition of independence. They argue that in real-life situations, testimonies are rarely truly independent. Witnesses might be influenced by shared background beliefs or cultural biases. That could create a kind of pseudo-coherence, which isn't really a reliable guide to the truth.
So like those witnesses who all saw Bigfoot might all be influenced by the same cultural myths or expectations. even if they didn't actually compare notes. Their agreement wouldn't be evidence for Bigfoot. It would just be a reflection of those shared biases.
Exactly, and that highlights how important it is to think critically about where coherence comes from before we assume it's telling us something true. Other philosophers have responded to Olson's challenge by looking at how coherence might be valuable, even if it doesn't directly make a belief more likely to be true.
So even if coherence isn't some magic truth detector, it might still have other benefits in terms of how we gain knowledge. What are some of those potential benefits?
One idea is that coherence could be confirmation conducive. So even if a coherent belief system isn't guaranteed to be true, it's more likely to be confirmed by evidence we get in the future.
So it's like coherence sets us up to be right, even if it doesn't guarantee we're right now.
Yeah, exactly. A coherent system is more likely to make accurate predictions about the future and more likely to be supported by new information. Another idea is that coherence is key for inference to the best explanation, which is a really important way we reason all the time. When we have to choose between different explanations for something, we naturally lean towards the one that best fits with what we already believe, the one that creates the most coherent overall picture.
It's like picking between different solutions to a puzzle, right? We tend to go with the solution where all the pieces fit together nicely, even if some of the details are still a bit blurry.
Exactly. Coherence helps us understand the world by identifying the most plausible, most comprehensive explanations for the things we see. And finally, there's the idea that coherence might be reliability conducive. This means that when we have a system of coherent testimonies, it makes us more confident that the sources themselves are reliable.
So the more consistent and interconnected the testimonies are, the more likely it is that the witnesses are telling the truth, even if we can't definitively prove that any specific claim is true.
That's the idea. Of course, like everything in philosophy, these ideas are still being debated and refined, but they show just how complex and multifaceted the role of coherence is in our pursuit of knowledge.
I'm noticing a theme here. It seems like coherentism, especially when you bring in probability, raises more questions than it answers.
That's the beauty of it, though, right? It forces us to really think about the complexities of knowledge, belief, and justification. It pushes us to move beyond simple models and see how intricate the relationship is between our beliefs and the world.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. From foundationalism to coherentism, from logic to probability, from basic definitions to some pretty mind-bending stuff. What's the main takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the big takeaway is that while coherentism is a really interesting alternative to foundationalism, it's not a simple fix. Defining and defending it in a rigorous way is an ongoing project for philosophers. And even if coherence doesn't magically guarantee truth, it's super important for how we organize our beliefs, make sense of the world, and deal with that constant flow of new information coming at us.
Well said. It's like we're always weaving and reweaving our webs of belief, trying to make them as coherent and strong as possible, while knowing that the ground beneath us might always be a little shaky.
I like that. And maybe, just maybe, the very act of thinking about these tough questions, wrestling with different perspectives, is itself a way of building coherence. We strengthen our own understanding by exploring these ideas together.
That's a great thought. And it brings us to a final thought-provoking question for our listeners. If our trust in coherence isn't just about truth, what other purposes might it serve? Maybe for our thinking or for how we interact with others. That could be a deep dive for another day.
Absolutely. Until then, keep those webs of belief strong and well connected.
Thanks for joining us on this philosophical adventure. And until next time, keep thinking deeply.